New American Poetry. 50 years should be easily perceptible, but to open the New American Poetry, and the shock is how ordinary it seems, and thus how hard it is to sense the passage of what, after all, has been 50 very real years. When I read Donald Allen's list of great modernists at the beginning of his introduction, for a few seconds, it's as if I'm reading in the present. I'll temporarily omit his opening phrase to further this temporal mirage. Quote, American poetry has entered upon a singularly rich period, one which has seen published William Carlos Williams's Patterson, The Desert Music and Other Poems, and Journey to Love, Ezra Pound's The Peas and Cantos, Section, Rock Drill, and Thrones. H.D.'s later work, culminating in her long poem Helen in Egypt, and the recent work of E.E. Cummings, Marianne Moore, and the late Wallace Stevens. Such a list seems, in 2010, obvious. Only one name, Cummings, would likely be omitted today. The late Wallace Stevens provides a glimmer of temporal shock, reminding us that in 1960, Stevens would have just died, and that Williams, Pound, H.D., Cummings, and Moore would still be alive. Allen's tone is so matter-of-fact that I have to remind myself of the implicit ruckus he is kicking up in the 1960 world, especially the 1960 academic world, starting with Williams, omitting Eliot, naming H.D. a modernist master. In 1960, to most literate minds in the U.S., H.D., far from being a modernist master, was a subject best not lingered on, like some maiden aunt's Ouija board. In 1960... to name Pound in such an unmarked way was polemical. It had only been 2 years, after all, since he'd gotten out of St. Elizabeth's and given the fascist salute as he boarded the boat for Italy. In 1960, to now quote the opening phrase I omitted above, in the years since the war, that's the opening of the introduction, it would have meant since 1945, when it had only been with strenuous backstage maneuvering that the case of Ezra Pound was dissociated from those of Lord Haw Haw and Tokyo Rose. But over 50 years, Allen's vision has become the commonest sense. This is reinforced by the plethora of greatest hits scattered throughout the book: projective verse, Howl, The Day Lady Died, and names without which American poetry is hard to imagine: Creeley, Ashbery, Whalen, Schuyler. The inclusion of statements on poetics now seems normative, but then it was not. Robert Frost's introduction to the 1958 Hall Pack Simpson anthology, New Poets of England and America, the anthology Allen must have been answering, explicitly bans, quote, critical instruction. And Frost, in the longer version of this, I will make the case that Frost is actually the target of Allen's assemblage. For instance, the only passage of iambic pentameter in the New American Poetry is Kenneth Koch's Something There Is That Does Not Hump a Sump. Anyway, in this alternate universe of the Pack Hall Simpson anthology, the passage of time couldn't be more blatantly legible. Here's the first stanza of the opening poem, Masters, by Kingsley Amis. That horse whose rider fears to jump will fall. Riflemen miss if orders sound unsure. They only are secure who seem secure. Who lose their voice lose all. That could have been written in the 19th century, possibly the 18th.
And was.
But lest we think that Allen's anthology was a juggernaut of inevitability, consider the list he picks to represent the second generation after the great modernists and leading to his third generation, i.e. to the poets he's anthologizing. It's a list never to be seen anywhere else, not these particular 5 names together. He names Elizabeth Bishop, Edwin Denby, Robert Lowell, Kenneth Rexroth, and Louis Zukofsky. Bishop and Lowell would be obvious in 1960, but not Rexroth to most people. Zukofsky and Denby would be outre names indeed. And those happy few who knew Zukofsky would not expect to see him linked with Denby, nor vice versa. Extrapolate the eccentricity of that list to the anthology as a whole, and the uniqueness of the New American Poetry becomes more apparent. It was a multiplicious and highly unlikely breakthrough. Our present tense common sense tells us Olson presides over the anthology, having the most pages of poetry and critical statement and leading off each section. But Allen's laconic watchwords in the introduction that what all this new poetry has in common is a, quote, total rejection of academic verse and that it is a continuation of modern jazz and abstract expressionism applies to Olson less than any other poet in the book, I would say. Nothing against Olson, but Allen's capacious, and a little footnote here, it's not capacious, of course, gender-wise or race-wise, but his capacious, non-stringent vision needs to be brought forward and given its causal due. The breadth of class position, of emotional, social, and aesthetic sophistication, the barbaric yops that fill the book discontinuously are a capacious space that today we can still aspire toward. Hats off to Donald Allen, without whom our present doesn't exist.